Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brain, your friendly neighborhood gaming dad, back with another video, and this one, I'll go ahead and warn you up front, is going to be kind of boring. We're going to go over some of the numbers that are involved with this game and the stats that apply to those numbers. I've recently sat down and figured out most of the damage formula for the game, and I understand a bit about how different stats factor into said formula. So I thought I would share that knowledge with the rest of you. First, let's start off with the troop stats themselves. Attack is exactly what you think it is. Raising your attack directly raises your normal attack damage, your skill attack damage, counter attack damage. After it is factored against your defense, this is what determines how much damage you're doing and how many troops your enemy is going to lose every single round of combat. Pretty straightforward. You raise attack, your damage numbers go up. It's one of what I would call watered down skills. I'll explain that a little bit later when I've finished them all. But raising attack raises damage. On the inverse, both defense and HP also factor into damage, but they factor against attack. In the damage formula, attack directly factors against defense first. So if you have someone with an even attack versus an even defense, they're not going to get a bonus over each other. 100 attack versus 100 defense is a complete wash. They will still do damage after the calculation is done, but it's not going to be that substantial. Think of it as adding a positive coefficient to an equation. Anything above 1 is going to make your damage go up. Anything below 1 is going to make your damage go down. It won't go negative, but having a higher defense than your opponent's attack does significantly decrease the amount of damage you're going to take. After attack is factored into defense, it then factors against the troop HP of your enemy. So after they've figured out if that number is above 1 or below 1, it's factored against the HP of the troop. Now this is the averages of these numbers. If you bring all T5 infantry like I'm looking at right now, the HP is going to be 193 plus the buffs that I have on it for another 194. If you bring mixed troops, it will add the HP, the defense, and the attack of all of those troops together and average it out before factoring in the damage, before continuing the calculation for damage. So these three stats are the watered down stats. There are calculations that occur immediately afterwards, and they have to do with the amount of troops that you have versus the amount of troops your enemy has. So raising your attack by 1% isn't going to raise your damage by 1%, but it is going to make a difference. It's just not as much of a difference as you would think. The last two stats I'll talk about here are travel speed and load. Load's pretty self-explanatory. This troop is going to carry 13 units of whatever you're trying to carry. Food, wood, steel, whatever. Pretty straightforward. Travel speed, I have not sat down and factored in exactly what the numbers mean, but higher numbers mean faster troops. Just to give you a little bit of a heads up, the higher tier troop that you have, the smaller the number is going to be. So you have tier 1 infantry being faster than your tier 5 infantry, or tier 4 infantry in this case. Riders, of course, are going to be faster than even them. This is faster than tier 4 infantry, and this is also faster than tier 1 infantry. Higher travel speed, faster troops on the map. Do with that what you will. Now, after you've factored in attack, defense, and HP, after you've calculated how many troops you have versus your enemy's troops. There's a couple other damage and damage reduction modifications that need to be made. Those being normal attack damage, counterattack damage, and skill damage buffs. Normal attack damage is going to be found in things like talents for different troop types, basic attack damage being increased by 2%, things such as that. Damage calculation buffs happen at the very end of damage calculation. They aren't watered down at all. A 2% damage buff is exactly what you get. If you would have killed 100 troops and you have a 2% damage buff, you would kill 102. It's pretty straightforward from there. Basic attack damage is only the damage that you're dealing to the target you are intentionally hitting. You'll only deal one instance of this. So this talent, for example, say my Raigoro is facing a Bella on the field, I will deal my basic attack damage to Bella on the field, and Bella will be dealing her basic attack damage back to me in a 1v1 situation. And we will also be dealing what's known as counter damage to each other as well. One round of combat in a 1v1 technically consists of 4 different hits if you're not factoring in skill damage. 2 basic attacks and 2 counter attacks. The cool thing about counter damage, and one of my favorite things to buff being an infantry main, is the fact that counter damage is dealt to anyone that deals basic attack damage to you. So if Raigoro gets swarmed by 5 or 6 people, and they're all dealing basic attack damage to him, he's dealing his counter attack damage back to all of them. Anyone that hits him is getting hit back. And thanks to some buffs, pretty hard. The last couple stats I need to talk about are damage reduction and skill attack damage. Damage reduction works in the same way as damage buffs. Anytime a damage would be dealt to you, if you have a damage reduction buff, it takes that percentage directly off of the top. Instead of dealing 100 damage to you, it would deal, in this case, 95. Nothing else is going to water that down. It's a straight 5% off the top. In some cases, that can get pretty ridiculous, such as reducing basic attack damage by 30%, as opposed to Raigoro's 5. So you understand how damage and damage reduction can be pretty broken. The last one is skill damage. Skill damage works in the same way, except it only applies to skills, whereas damage applies to all of them. Now you have a 30% skill damage buff on Lewis, meaning that if you would do 1,000 damage, you would instead do 1,300. It's a pretty substantial bonus, especially on skill damage commanders, and June has a very similar one, if I'm not mistaken, increasing skill damage by another 25%. Pairing these two together is a 55% skill damage buff, not watered down in the slightest. Well, I believe that's everything as far as a basic overview of how the stats and different buffs work in this game. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. Again, this is Mr. Brain, your friendly neighborhood gaming dad.